individual defense and working as micro teams. Last week we started talking about the synergy of a team, specifically a micro team, and started thinking about how individuals can work together in order to defend life and property. The remaining webinars will now take these basic fundamentals and further develop them in order to learn how to work as teams, full built-out teams and units in order to defend businesses, schools, churches, and communities. In order to do this, we have created a case study to help illustrate the steps necessary to work as a team or unit in order to defend your community. The case study animates the threats faced by individuals, parents, business owners, church officials, and school administrators. You will find the case study contents inside of the O2DA Defense Academy. The group that you're part of, the Homeland Defending Your Homeland group, has this, the case study right there, so you'll be able to access it right within that group. And the case study is essentially a composite construction of actual events and relationships experienced by some of us here at Pulse. The setting for the case study is Detroit, Michigan, and follows a fictitious family named the Schmitz, who own a fictitious business called Auto Parts Distributors, APD, and happen to still live in the inner city. The Schmitz, from the standpoint of the background story, immigrated to Detroit from Germany in the early 1900s, like many, and started a business related to the auto industry. The current owner-manager of APD, of Auto Parts Distributors, is Fred Schmidt, who is fourth generation. The family still lives in what we call the Baker Ford Historic District of Detroit, where the family first settled 100 years ago. Within the case study itself, you will find the following contents that include the full backstory on the family, on the Schmidt family and Auto Parts Distributors. I just highlighted a few points there. You will also find a detailed security briefing which describes the threats that confront APD. There is a site survey detailing the physical premises. You will find a detailed mission essential task list or medal for the defense of APD. You will see an actual wargaming exercise that describes a potential gang assault on APD and an after action report, or AAR, of that assault. The case study itself will be the focus of our remaining webinars and will help to illustrate and animate the steps you need to go through in order to build your own private defense network, which is capable of defending life and property within your own communities. So with this, I'm going to hand it over to Bill Talon and Ron Danielowski, who will present the bulk of today's topics. And let me come up here and change the presenter. Bill Talon, you should now be the presenter.
Oh, can you see my screen?
I can.
All right, welcome everybody. Let me dive right in here. We have a lot of information that I'm going to speak through today. Most of it is in fact portrayed on the slides, so if I go a little fast, forgive me, but it will be available to you for review later on. Now, in the context of defending businesses and churches, here's the context as we see it. America is on the verge of massive civil unrest. And recent examples like San Bernardino and Orlando are probably just precursors and representatives of the wave of terrorist action that we are likely to see in the near future. We've also seen, after a approximately 20-year period of decline decline in stability. We're seeing violent crime rates growing, especially in urban areas across the country. And in this environment of emerging threats, we're seeing that conventional mechanisms like law enforcement, the judicial system, and insurance coverage are going to fail to cope with these dangers. They won't provide the level of security that individuals or business owners or communities have come to expect. It is indeed a new paradigm. The foundation of security is self-reliance, as we've said in previous installments of this webinar. It's the ability to defend yourself and your family from violent threats. The next logical step, in light of those emerging threats, is to build upon that foundation of self-reliance by forming networks of simpatico individuals, other self-reliant armed citizens who organize themselves to protect specific locales, such as a business or a church, an institution, or a larger community. Private defense networks, what we call a PDN, are the only practical way to fill that gap between emerging threats and the state's diminishing ability to protect us. We discussed this at some length in prior webinars, but again, our belief is that based on what we see almost every day, is that when violent threats actually materialize in your life, you are very unlikely to be saved by the police. The police are minutes away, at best, hours away at worst. And though they will respond and they'll react competently and bravely, they're not going to be there at the point of contact when you need them. So, a private defense network is composed of individuals who share trust, vision, and initiative. They pull together to benefit from the depth and the synergy of working together collectively to provide security. A PDN may be a community effort. It may be formed by a business who lacks faith in quick response by police and is tired of expensive security contractors who provide underpaid and undertrained guards who provide little actual defense at the moment of contact in crisis. Maybe a church concerned about the mounting incidents of armed attacks on their premises or on their worshipers. Now, we'll talk quite a bit more about private defense networks in the last two webinars in this series. But the first step, again, is that you, as an individual, become competent in the use of firearms for self-defense and the defense of your home and family. Building upon that foundation, if you're a leader in your own place of employment or in your church, then you yourself can begin the process of organizing a functioning network. If you are not in a position of leadership, then you're going to have to sell the idea to those who are. And you may be speaking to people who share your concerns and may not have your vision of an achievable solution. And if that is your situation, then we hope to provide you the ammunition, so to say, to make that case. And here is a very important proviso. All your preparations and actions, everything that you do individually or collectively, must remain within the law. We do not envision any circumstances here at Pulse where private citizens acting in self-defense would be justified in acting against properly constituted authority. You are on the side of civil order and the rule of law, and you must act accordingly. All right, the first steps in securing your church or business. First, you must form a security cadre. This requires that you select qualified volunteers from within your workforce for a business or your congregation and parishioners at the church, preferably those who have concealed carry permits and who can document credible training with small arms. You're going to have to find or develop leaders who combine those qualifications with leadership experience and ability. You will have to identify training requirements and establish a program for initial and recurrent training. As Mike spoke a little bit earlier, Pulse provides a tremendous amount of architecture and advice and structure for that requirement, and you will find this in the Defense Academy when you have a chance to. And finally, you'll have to create, rehearse, test, and refine plans for normal times and emergency response. Step number 2, identify threats and vulnerabilities that are specifically pertinent to your situation. You'll be applying the logic of the area study, the site survey, threat assessments, and vulnerability assessments, which we cover in great detail in our online team tactics and unit tactics manuals, of which we will speak more later in this presentation. Third step, you must take steps and make plans to monitor and control access to your property by physical security and by the vigilance of trained observers who can give advance warning of threats. Step 4 is to ensure that you have an on-site emergency medical response capability, because just as police response is likely to be delayed in the event of a crisis, emergency medical service response will also be delayed. You need to find and enlist as volunteers qualified personnel within your own organization, and you need to equip them so that they can provide immediate life-saving care before the first responders arrive on scene. And finally, you must coordinate with local law enforcement. You need to obtain their support for all the steps that you take to enhance your security. Pulse's intent to defend protocol provides detailed guidance in how to approach this. This is a critical step, and we will link to and discuss this a little further in the presentation. It is vital that you establish those links and that shared confidence, because you will have police involvement in any incident that occurs, and for their safety and your own safety, prior coordination is very important. Now, as we go on today, we're going to focus most of our discussion today upon security challenges and solutions for business. In that list of steps that we just went through, you saw that the basics are really the same for houses of worship. The most significant difference probably is that a church's security cadre is more likely to consist of volunteers than paid employees of a business. Now, that has probably positive and negative implications, because it means a difference in culture and individual commitment and at the organizational level compared to a business setting. We do provide in Pulse some specific recommendations. Church will these issues. Show you where you will find that under resources in the Defense Academy, recommendations, church recommendations, and you will find some very, very detailed recommendations that are focused upon the situation and the challenges that could face a church in this sort of situation. Now, let's move into our historical discussion as background. Previous webinars in this series, we've discussed civil disorder at some length. We've used examples such as the 1992 Los Angeles riots, the Rodney King riots. Today we're going to look in some depth at an earlier example, which may be equally predictive of what's coming. For those who did not experience the period of riots and civil disorders in the 1960s and 1970s are difficult to appreciate. The scale, the intensity, and the duration of that period of unrest is something that we have not seen since, although we may be seeing the beginning of it again now. Those civil disorders were predicated mostly on race and on the socioeconomic and political factors related to racial tensions. They were exacerbated by leftist rhetoric They reflected a wider rift in the culture over issues like the Vietnam War, which generated its own momentum of protest, and the growth of a revolutionary counterculture. A pertinent quote from H. Rap Brown, who was a notorious African-American activist in 1967. As you see here, he said, "You have got to arm yourself because the man is ready and he is going to turn black policemen against you. You can no longer sit back. You have got to get yourself some gun, because if you don't get guns, then your daughters will have to get guns if they are still." "1967, the long hot summer, it's called, saw a total of 159 race riots across the U.S. You see the list, a short list of the cities in which they occurred. You can see they spanned north, south, east, west, nationwide. In 1968, this trend continued. In 1968, we also saw the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where organized large-scale protests mixed anti-war and counterculture and racial themes. Those protests, of course, turned very violent and disruptive. That was, in some ways, the first example where you had multiple streams of discontent and protest merging together. That pattern continued through the early 1970s. In Albuquerque, in the summer of 1971, there was a week of disorder that resulted from a combination that was predictable and presaged by the 1968 convention, a combination of Hispanic political activism and anti-war sentiment. And there in Albuquerque, New Mexico, over a period of several days, many hundreds of people were injured, many businesses were destroyed. But of course, some will say that we live in a happier era now of general prosperity without racial animosity or political polarization, so those examples are of historical significance only, and it could never happen again. But that last statement is rather foolish on the face of it, and I think we have to admit that the possibility of a reprise of the 1960s and 70s is in front of us. We have the examples of the Seattle World Trade Organization riots in 1999, the Los Angeles riots which followed immediately after that. We have Ferguson in 2014, Baltimore in 2015, and the growing level of violent protests at political rallies across the country this year. Do these suggest an emerging pattern and a precursor or a prediction of what we're going to see? So now we're going to go into some detailed look at one of the largest events in those earlier years, and that will be the 1967 Detroit riot. Between 1964 and the Detroit riot in 1967, there had already been 300 race riots across the country. Tensions and discontent ran high, needing only a trigger, which in this event on July 23rd, 1967, it was a police raid on an after-hours bar in Detroit. A crowd gathered as the police loaded 82 patrons into their paddy wagons. Bottles and bricks began to fly as the police drove off. The crowd was growing. The riot began. By noon of that day, there were 10,000 people in the streets, and some looting, assault, and just were well underway. This may sound familiar. Police initially adopted a policy of restraint, cordoning off the 12th Street district and not intervening, hoping not to incite the rioters further. It did not work any better for them than it did in Ferguson or in Baltimore. The rioting spread. On the second day of the riot, Governor George Romney committed the National Guard, but most of the Michigan National Guard was conducting their 2-week annual training 200 miles away. Only a small contingent was present in Detroit, so it took hours for the National Guard to deploy and reach the city. As the rioting spread, the governor requested federal military assistance, which had been offered in several of the the other riots that had erupted over the last year or two prior. But now political animosity and rivalries, which again seem to be predictive or paralleling our current situation, these intervened and delayed the federal response. Democratic President Johnson waited to commit until he could claim that Romney, a leading Republican politician, had lost control of the situation. He also hesitated to commit U.S. troops because he was at the height of the protest and anti-Vietnam War movement, and he anticipated bad publicity if he sent U.S. troops into a U.S. city, and it resulted in the deaths of U.S. citizens. So while the political wrangling went on, lives were lost, blocks were burned. Eventually, within 3 to 4 days of the beginning of the riots, 8,000 Michigan National Guardsmen, 360 state police officers, and almost 5,000 soldiers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were deployed, supported by tanks and armored personnel carriers. The images that you can see, like the one here of armored vehicles operating on the streets of U.S. City, were somewhat unprecedented and something that we have not seen since. The Detroit Police Department, which was already resented in the black community in a way which again parallels the state of police and community relations today, was guilty of several incidents of brutality or excessive force, and they were accused of many more. The Guardsmen, as was the case across the country at that time, the Guardsmen were poorly trained for civil unrest. The federal troops, somewhat better trained and considerably better disciplined, many of them with a recent Vietnam experience, were more effective when they reached the streets, and federal military command over the situation helped to quell the widespread violence after 4 days. But as the looting began to subside and the crowds thinned out, a new problem emerged, and that was the committed, politically motivated revolutionaries who still call the riots the Great Rebellion. They took over, and there were multiple sniper incidents where people were firing rifles upon policemen, firemen, and troops from upper stories of buildings, particularly interfering with the firefighter response to the thousands of fires in central Detroit. As you see there, 2,500 rifles were stolen from local stores. Troops and police returned fire, and there are cases which are just pretty notable when we go back and we think about this happening in a domestic peacetime environment. There were cases of military units and large cadres of police assaulting through buildings to take out snipers on upper floors. By the fifth day, order was largely restored. 43 dead by the official tally, almost 1,200 injuries, 7,000 arrests. Rioters in the street during the first 3 days, estimates ranged from 10,000 to 100,000. Over 2,500 stores looted or burned, 412 buildings completely demolished. Many families left homeless, many businesses destroyed. Property losses estimated between 40 to 80 million in 1967 dollars. There's one little vignette that shows the experience of a businessman in the district, the 12th Street district where the riots began. Irving Goldstein operated a jewelry store and rented warehouse space nearby. Asked for police assistance to help him remove his safe, which held, as you see, $100,000 in diamonds, plus a lot of cash. The police were unable to help. 4 days later, looters who apparently knew Mr. Goldstein's business pretty well came through the exterior wall of the building, stole the safe, and burned the warehouse to the ground. Mr. Goldstein stayed and rebuilt his business, only to be looted again in the 1968 riots after the Martin Luther King assassination, after which he said, as you see here, "I felt like my whole life had been wasted, 20 years wiped out. I wouldn't go back to 12th Street if they paved it with diamonds." Now, let's consider a hypothetical scenario. As the Republican National Convention approaches this summer in 2016, political tensions ramp up nationwide. Social networking, a factor not present in the 1960s, facilitates a plan for coordinated massive civil disturbances in many American cities to protest the presumptive Republican nominee. Authorities brace for protests, but both authorities and the general public are largely unaware and unprepared for these protests to become a catalyst for political polarization, economic discontent, racial resentment, and anti-police sentiment. The synthesis of all of those trends and factors is something that played heavily in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and we are poised for a similar phenomenon again. On the first day of the convention in July 2016, Detroit citizens are perhaps uncertain or apprehensive, but most businesses open, people report for work, and Fred Schmidt's Auto Parts Distributors, the subject of the case study that Mike introduced to you a little while ago, is one of these businesses. 12 blocks away from APD, the protest grows and gains momentum throughout the morning. Police respond to isolated reports of assault and property destruction, and the crowd, thereby agitated and incited, they erupt into violence, attack the police, destroying cars and storefronts. An organized response by police in riot gear succeeds only in scattering the crowd, estimated at this time at about 18,000, like water on a hot skillet. The crowd disperses in all directions, with smaller contingents of riders assaulting pedestrians, overturning vehicles, and causing general mayhem. Around midday, Fred Schmidt, who has been monitoring police frequencies and local news outlets, decides to shut down early, send his workers home before the situation deteriorates further. He advises his 250 employees to clock out and head for home, avoiding the downtown area where the civil unrest has been centered. But he's a bit late. As his workforce begins to empty into the parking lot, and the first cars head for the one gated exit onto the street, a group of riders appear on the street outside and begin to flow through the open gates. Employee vehicles are blocked from leaving, and the car closest to the gate is surrounded by rioters who pull the driver out of his seat, throw him to the ground, and begin to kick and beat him. From the main entrance of the APD building, 4 individuals in street clothing emerge and run toward the activity around the gate. They shout to employees in the lot to leave their cars and return to the building as they jog forward. Approaching in a loose wedge-like formation, they draw the attention of the riders, who begin to move toward them. But loud positive commands from those 4 to stop and get back are accompanied by the presentation of handguns from concealed holsters. Riders who see the weapons slow and recoil back toward the gate. 6 more individuals emerge from the APD entrance, these carrying a mix of long arms, shotguns, and semi-automatic rifles. They spread out and move forward to support their companions. The first 4 individuals move directly to the scene of the assault. 2 holster their weapons, pull the remaining assailant off the employee who is on the ground, and secure his hands behind his back with zip ties. 2 other unarmed employees reach the injured man and help him back toward the building. The 10 armed individuals now form a loose skirmish line and begin walking slowly backward toward the building, ensuring the lot behind and around them is clear of APD employees. The assailant is left behind on the ground. His friends cut him loose and he disappears into the crowd. The rioters at the gate, who now appear to be between 50 and 100, appear intimidated by the show of force and back out of the gate to drift off of the street. Within 15 minutes of the first appearance of trouble, all APD personnel are accounted for inside the lockdown building. After another 15 minutes with no apparent hostile activity, the security team reemerges, conducts a quick sweep through the parking lot in 2-man teams, closes and secures the drive gate and adjacent pedestrian gate, and then posts at the four corners of the building to maintain continuous observation of the lot and premises. When two police cruisers arrive 4 hours later in response to APD's 911 call, they find one non-critically injured person under the care of an EMT certified employee, as well as armed employees with weapons either holstered or slung, and with recognition items, identification friend or foe recognition items specified in prior coordination and in the 911 call, prominently displayed and visible. They are met at the gate by a plant foreman and are admitted to the property and begin to collect information for their report. I'm going to turn over control now to Ron Danielowski, who will talk to you about what the conditions were which allowed APD to respond effectively to this hypothetical situation. Should now have control.
Bill, I believe I have it. Can you let me know if you can see the next slide coming up for me?
I do. I see it.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So the question that Bill posed there, what enabled APD to effectively respond? In the bullet points there, you saw one of them was the threat assessment. And the one thing that we point out in that threat assessment is that it is really a threat assessment of your own design. It's something you, your team, the leaders in the group are going to sit down and build. If, as you can see here, I'm in the Defense Academy now, and you can see that we go into a great deal of detail talking about this threat assessment, giving you solid examples of how the threat assessment is built. And based upon that threat assessment, the ATP staff, management, and the teams are training themselves, and they're rehearsing for the most likely threats that they have come up with in their threat matrix. And as you can see here, the threat matrix gears the threats or rates those threats from the least likely and least dangerous to the most likely and the most dangerous, and then they prepare accordingly. If you'll recall Bill's discussion on the teams and the management all working together, and then as importantly getting into the intended offense and then coordinating with the local law enforcement agencies to prepare themselves better, and so the law enforcement agency knows who is where, what's going on, and really where they need to be focusing their efforts, and in particular where they don't need to be focusing their effort when it's taken care of and they know they have people in the area. And the other part of that effective response is that those leaderships and the businesses, the community, all the way down to the teams included in the private community as well in the public sector with law enforcement is getting together. They are training, they're wargaming together for all these types of most likely possibilities. We talk about wargaming in the Defense Academy, and that wargaming takes on numerous different flavors, from your three-dimensional tabletops, sand tables, down to like your board game wargaming type tools, and as well as the inexpensive and flexible and tools like from the computer wargaming that you can work with on your own, all very inexpensive for you to do that with your teams. That's all covered here in the Defense Academy as well. And if we look at that, then what we see is that we have the team tactics that are dependent upon our strong individual skills. And what that means is these micro teams, whether it's something like a team structure that you're looking at, or if you're looking at small team tasks, those are all outlined in the Defense Academy as well. Give you examples, rough examples, how you might use those to your benefit. In this entire process also is included additional roles such as EMT, etc., that are all coordinating, all working together, all getting training together, etc. And as I mentioned previously, what we're looking at there is those team skills all hang very tightly on your individual skills. And just keeping that in context, we keep hammering on this because it can't be really said often enough. And that is that those skills that you have as an independent, what we call the independent operator, is what those team tactics all hold on to. It's that glue that really holds that together. As we said it last time, is that the weakest link in that chain is the individual and his inability to perform certain tasks. So it really does come down to the individual skills. Skills such as, for instance, stance and grip, which you can see here in the Defense Academy. If you go to our manuals, our videos, you'll see the handgun drills, shotgun drills, rifle drills, and you'll see in there we start with a lot of information just on each one of those individual drills. We give you video examples and talk you through not just the how, but the why these types of things are important and why they matter. Things like that grip and stance, and we talk about the proper positions for the weapon system, whether it's a position where you're actually being ready to fight, or you think you might be in a position you might have to fight. All those things start coming into play with other individual skills, such as understanding your sphere of influence, what that means to you in a tactical situation. Things like spalling, that is the little pieces of metal and copper or lead, whatever that round may hit, that disintegrates when it doesn't necessarily hit the target it's looking for. Maybe it hits a wall. How that all plays into effect then rolls into you being able to what we call slice the pie, or use angles to your benefit where you're at in that particular scenario, and then how that all boils down then into the individual tactics of, for instance, taking cover appropriately in here. Maybe how to get to cover appropriately, and then you can see we go into a great deal of what that might look like for given scenarios and why those things are important. So throughout the Defense Academy, not only do we show you how it's done, but we explain the whys of why it's done the way it is. And so in a general overview of these, what you can really see here is from the top down, in this instance, is where we have the strategic level planning, and we have the operational level that is able to disperse that training and coordinate all that, which all then again hangs upon that individual's ability to operate and interface with other people in his team and in his community to come to a resolution, a swift and solid resolution to tactical problems on the ground. There's obviously a lot more in there to it, but as a good broad brushstroke overview, you get the idea of how all these things tie together.